I'm Jackie Gurden. I'm down here today in Okarito with Anne Hall, and Anne, today we're going to be talking about the history of Okarito, and we're in August 2011, so let's go through it. Now Anne, a lovely photo of Okarito. Tell us briefly what you're going to talk about on this photo story today.
Well, it'll be mainly the European history, which started in the 1860s with the discovery of gold on the beaches of the west coast, and as far as Okarito is concerned, at 5 Mile, which is a beach 5 miles south of Okarito, but Okarito was the port for the whole of South Westland, in fact, although as we will see it was not a very good port, but it remained a port for subsequently the forestry. There was silver pine industry of quite a massive extent, and quite a bit of flax milling. And after that it is downhill all the way until it came up again with tourism.
So this is a photo of gold mining on the beach, and that's really where Okarito started, isn't it? Just tell us a wee bit about this, Anne.
Well, there was a tremendous amount of gold found, but it was a very brief rush. There were a lot of people here, far more than there are now, and of course on the whole of the west coast there were more people than there are living on the west coast currently in this particular century. But Okarito had something like 30 hotels, and there were people. There was quite a big settlement at 5 Mile, and there were boats coming to and fro from here. There were the way gold miners have always been. They would come here, come hell or high water. They walked down the coast and they got drowned in the rivers, and they died of starvation coming over Arthur's Pass. And this is the way things were for the gold miners right through the world. This west coast mining, of course, started after the Otago ones had started to decline, but it didn't last very long. But it's interesting because subsequently they had a dredge going at 5 Mile, which in fact went right through until the Second World War, and they got quite a bit of gold from that. And of course now people are looking again for gold because the price is so high, so various people go out with little claims on the beach and have a go.
And Donovan's store seemed to be the oldest wooden building left on the west coast. Huge history with this, a lot of investment gone into it with the Department of Conservation. Tell us about Donovan's store.
Well, of course it was originally a hotel, and as indeed there were plenty of hotels down here, and it is said that in the attic, which is still there, the dancing girls lived up there, and they would come down those stairs that are still there, and it was quite a place. But it's called Donovan's store because it became a store at about the end of the 19th century, I think, and a fellow called Donovan ran it for many, many years. He was a real trick, that guy. He was a member of the Westland District Council, or whatever it was called then, County Council, and he used to ride his horse all the way up to Hokitika, never missed a meeting. But he was actually well known for a fair bit of drinking, various things like that. But he had that store for many years, and people still... and then subsequently he sold it to a fellow who was always called Robbie, who ran it in fact until the 1950s, and people still remember coming down here. It was open in the weekends and getting ice creams there at Donovan's store. Of course we didn't have the electricity down here at Okarito until the 1970s, so when Donovan's store was first open and run, it ran without any electricity at all. But it's now a Category 1 historic building, and it is run by the Department of Conservation with a lot of input from the Okarito Community Association, and indeed we have concerts there and various functions, and greatly appreciated by the people who come down to do any sort of concerts, because it's got such a marvellous history. And actually it's not bad for acoustics either, and it's certainly a help now we've got electricity. This is a photo of a little boat that used to bring the flax down from the flax mill, which was originally, I'm not quite sure when, but I think last century, or 20th century anyway, before then, where they had a flax mill up there and brought the flax down to the wharf shed And then later on in the 1940s, there was a flax mill up on the spit, the Okarito spit that you saw in that first photograph. And of course, flax milling was quite an interesting occupation right through New Zealand. But of course, the beginning of plastics finished flax.
So the main uses of flax, what was
rope.
Rope. It was really held everything together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, until plastics came along.
Yes, and flax was particularly good once they'd learned how to process it, which is quite a performance. I've got a record of the fellow who worked in the 1940s up there at the flax mill, and they'd strip it all and they'd put it out to dry, and then they put it into bales and brought it all.
So was the flax just kept here on the west coast, or did it?
Oh no, it was exported. I'm not sure where they manufactured it. I don't know. There may have been a manufacturer. There certainly wasn't one here. There was only the fact that it came down to the wharf, and of course there was no road into Okarito until 1910, when Seddon, who very cunningly made sure that the bridges across the rivers started south and finished north, so there was no possibility of anything developing before the southern part developed. So that was rather clever, and that wasn't finished till 1910. Until that, it was all having to go out over the bar and to various places in New Zealand.
So it was a really reproductive wharf here.
Yes, yeah. Mm. This is a shot of the wharf taken just today, really, the day we're recording, and a lagoon is blocked, which is again a great big history of Okarito, going back long before European occupation. It's always known to have blocked frequently. At present it's blocked, and so you can't get into the wharf except with some pretty high gumboots. But that actual wharf itself, the piles for it and things, has been here since the 1860s. That little wharf shed there has just been there since the 1970s, when there was something called the Okarito Improvement Society, and the wharf was suggested everything get pulled down, and so local people got together and said, no, this is an important thing, a historical part of Okarito, and we're going to keep it, and they built that wharf shed. Prior to that, there was possibly some early wharf shed, and then in 1890 they built a great big wharf shed, and I think that might have been because they'd started to farm over on the spit, and then also there was the flax milling and possibly sheep and things, because there was a certain amount of farming around the place. But the wharf's really got quite a history, and it's very nice to think that it's still there, that it has managed to be preserved, although the actual building's not so very old, but it's where it's always been. I talked about the flooding, which you saw in the current wharf situation, and the bar of the Okarito Lagoon, which is a huge lagoon with an enormous amount of water in it, gets blocked, as indeed do all the bars and all the lagoons on the west coast, but the Okarito Lagoon is by far the biggest. It's also got a south opening, which is interesting, and it is always blocked quite frequently. And this is a picture of unblocking the lagoon back before the current type of digger was introduced to the world. And there are the horses, and there are all the people digging like mad, and horses working away, and the whole thing took absolutely ages to do. Nowadays there's one digger comes down, and within an hour or so it opens the lagoon. So life is fairly different. This is what is still called the Youth Hostel, although currently it's run by the Department of Conservation, and it is a little hostel which is very much appreciated by people who come down. And guess what it looks like? It looks like a little old school, and that's exactly and precisely what it was. And in fact, it was originally a hotel, apparently, the part of the building, and then it was moved to its current site further up the village in 1900, and in 2000 we had a 100-year celebration of it, and all sorts of people came who'd lived in Okarito in the past, but it still inside looks like a little old schoolhouse, and that's what it's been for a long time. If we go on to the next photograph, This is a picture of the present little building when it was used as a schoolhouse, and that is the school teacher on the left and the pupils at that time in about, I don't know, 1920s or something, I think, when there was this school. I think that's probably Mary Hevold, who lived up at the Forks and who was the school mistress there, and the children that attended the school that time. This is a picture of the residents of Okarito, and I suspect people who came to what was then called town, which was Okarito was at that time for everyone in South Westland, more or less. And Richard John Seddon, whom anyone who knows anything about New Zealand history knows that he was a very famous Prime Minister, and he came from the West Coast, and he was doing a tour of South Westland, and there are the people ready to receive him at Okarito in 1906.
And of course 1906 was the year of his death, so this was just before
before he went overseas, I think.
And he was a premier for 13 years, wasn't he?
Long time.
Longest serving?
I think so. Yes, possibly even currently. I'm not sure about that, but
and it would have been quite a trip to have actually covered the coast and.
Yes, but he was very keen. He was a lovely picture of him at Salis Mill as well, and all over the place. I think he rather liked having his picture taken. And there's plenty about him in the Hokitika Museum too.
Right.
We mentioned Okarito being town to the whole of South Westland, and one of the things about it is that there was a race course, and the race course was over on the island. It's very difficult to see now, but in the first photograph we showed, I think, somewhere you could actually see an outline of it. But there's them swimming the horses across to the race course, and people came down and went up in boats to go to the races.
It's a pretty unique way of getting to the races, isn't it? The horses are going to swim.
Now the island is so overgrown you can't even see where the race course was. But also, of course, over on the spit, that's the other side, there was quite a bit of farming going on, so they certainly swam the cattle like that too across, having to watch it when the lagoon was flowing out very briskly. It was a little dangerous, but horses, of course, were an interesting thing. But part of being town, they had sports days here, and people came for Christmas to the hotels, and Gar Graham remembers coming down for family holidays at the hotel and swimming in one of the lagoons, and it was known to the locals. And as I say, before the road went in, it was town for South Westland, surprisingly enough.
It took a wee while for them to get home from the races too sometimes, didn't it?
I would think so. It took, well, from any of the parties too, I might say. They would ride up from, way down Fox and things, up the beach, and get there in time for the party, and then they'd, sleep over and go back the next day. It was quite a performance, but very important, of course, for those early settlers to meet with other people, and it was this was a great point. It was long before the Franz Joseph was developed, of course. There was just a little bit of farming at Whataroa, so that was not developed for a long time, until the roads went through properly, you see, really.
So
and
this was,
bridges.
This was the hub then? It was
yes,
really
yes, it was the hub. Yeah.
Mm.
This is a photo of Charlie Douglas, who was a very, very well-known West Coaster who did tremendous surveying all over the West Coast, and his grave is actually in the Okarito Cemetery, at least Hokitika Cemetery. But what is not generally known is that he in fact lived at Okarito for some considerable time, and he was a great friend of Gerald Mueller's, who was someone who did a lot of surveying up and down the coast, and is also pretty well known. And in fact, Gerald Mueller had a house down here, and the site is still there, and he kept that site right through until he died in 1928, that it still belonged to him at that stage, so he must have been very fond of it. And his book, written by the granddaughter, My Dear Banny, which is his letters to his wife, talking about her coming to Okarito to be with him, with their baby, and of course he constantly talks about the boats that she should come in, and I looked it up once, and about 50% of those boats actually got wrecked on the west coast, which is what things were like. It wasn't a simple thing to come here by boat in the early days. This is the monument, a sort of phallic structure near the youth hostel, which we have to keep reminding the council to paint because it actually belongs to the council. But it was erected in 1940 under the mistaken belief that this was the place where Abel Tasman first sighted New Zealand. It has now been shown that in fact that was somewhere up near Westport or something, which is rather a pity, but it's got various tributes to the early pioneers and things like that, and was opened with great solemnity by the government of the day, which included Peter Fraser and cohorts and all the local residents around, obviously, ready to celebrate a party for whatever reason, which we still do. Going back to this photo, which is taken from the Trig, and the Trig is the most beautiful walk up to a Trig station, obviously, that was in fact put there, I think, by Gerald Mueller way back. And there's a beautiful walk up to that, which is a very famous walk, and one that's kept up by the Department of Conservation and is probably the most done walk on the west coast. I'm not sure of the exact figures, but certainly it is incredibly beautiful, with this lovely view back at the lagoon and lovely views back the other way to 5 Mile, and particularly marvellous views of the main divide, all the mountains when it's clear. But Okarito went into a tremendous decline after the 1950s when the hotel, the one and only remaining hotel, burnt down, and from that time it really went to just 2 or 3 people living here and thought to be going to disappear altogether. But in the 1970s, the land on the to the seaward side of the Strand of course originally was the Strand, it was along the sea, but there was a lot of as is true of the whole of the west coast of New Zealand, there's accretion of land on the west coast coming up from the south, and that land was balloted, and quite a lot of people got balloted sections and built there, and quite a few of the present residents are actually living there. So since the 1970s it has come out of the doldrums, and now it is so much out of the doldrums that the sections are extremely expensive, but it's still a very beautiful place with kayaking and boat trips, and lovely for fishing, and no shops, and a very laid-back, beautiful place, we think, in contrast to, say, the Franz Josef Glacier, which is only 30 kilometres away, which is very much more touristy.
Now, Anne, you've had a huge involvement with conservation here on the West Coast. Let's talk about this.
Well, it's something I've always, because I love the outdoors so much, is the reason that I came to live here at Okarito. I negotiated myself a job as a health service and worked for over 10 years, which was wonderful because I got to know the whole of the coast from Karamea down to Haast. But Okarito is where I acquired a section in the 1980s, but I've been coming here since 1949, so I've been coming backwards and forwards ever since and have always loved it. And there are some marvellous features. I mean, one thing it's known for is the white heron, because in the Waitangituana, not at Okarito, that's north, and you get to it from Whataroa, is the only breeding colony in New Zealand of the white heron, but they feed in the Okarito Lagoon, so we see them flying past the house. One once came and landed on my veranda, so it's really rather beautiful. And the other thing, of course, that is quite extraordinary is the Okarito brown kiwi. There are 5 species of kiwi in New Zealand, and one of them's the Okarito brown kiwi, which is just in this particular area, and it's enormously well looked after by the Department of Conservation, which put a tremendous effort into helping with the breeding and all sorts of complicated things about Operation Nest Egg and so on, which is very worthwhile. And from Okarito there is a tourist trip that can be done. One of the local residents here who actually takes you into the forest where you see kiwi in their natural habitat, and I think it's really the only place in New Zealand, apart from Stewart Island, where you see them on the beach, where you actually see kiwi, you know, real wild kiwi in their own little bit of bush. And the other thing that's happened recently is that Air New Zealand has joined with, DOC has got a grant from Air New Zealand to be doing all sorts of restoration of the wetland, because this Okarito Lagoon is a very, very large wetland and very, very special, and you wouldn't say it was totally pristine, but it's not too bad really, and there's a lot going on. We've got a nursery down here, so there's just so much about here that's beautiful. The thing is that it's a very, very nice community with enormous support. Everybody supports everyone else. We also have a lot of very, very good parties. But the main thing for me is that I actually think it's the most beautiful place in the world, because you've got all these wonderful mountains in the skyline. You've got the sea coming in, just quite incredible. Hector's dolphins too, by the way. And you've got the lagoon, and then you've got this marvellous podocarp forest, which is virtually untouched as well. So altogether it's pretty special. Not everybody likes it. Some people come down here and say, oh, look at all that gorse, and, you know, what the hell's the point of this? I can't buy anything, no shops. But for those of us who love it, and those people who visit and love it, it is very, very special indeed.
Well, Anne, thanks very much for sharing all your knowledge and history with us, and I'm sure into the future lots of people will be interested in this history that we've taken this afternoon, so very appreciative of that. Thank you.